Disrespect rarely starts as aggression. It doesn't begin with shouting, insults, or obvious hostility. It starts small, subtle, easy to dismiss. A comment that feels slightly off, a moment where you're talked over, a tone that feels just a little diminishing. Nothing big enough to justify a reaction, nothing clear enough to call out without seeming sensitive. And that's exactly why it works. Because people aren't deciding your value in one dramatic moment. They're gathering data, quietly, repeatedly. And every time a small test passes without resistance, something gets recorded. Not emotionally, but socially. A boundary was flexible, a line was negotiable, your space was adjustable. This is how social rank actually updates. Not through declarations, not through arguments, but through tiny moments that reveal what costs you in force and what you silently absorb. What matters isn't the disrespect, it's what your response teaches. This is where most people misread what's happening. They think the issue is personality, confidence, charisma, but social systems don't update based on traits. They update based on tolerated patterns. The first type of disrespect often hides inside normal conversation. Someone talks over you, cuts in before you finish, redirects the topic while you're still speaking. Individually, it feels minor, accidental even. People interrupt all the time. Conversations overlap. But interruptions are not just communication glitches. They are tests of conversational authority. When someone interrupts you, they're doing something very specific. They're checking whether your speaking space has enforcement. Imagine explaining an idea in a meeting. Halfway through your sentence, someone jumps in with their own thought. You pause, you nod, you let them finish. It feels polite, cooperative, mature, but socially, something else just happened. Your unfinished point did not get reclaimed. Your speaking space was surrendered. And here's the deeper layer most people miss. Conversations aren't just exchanges of ideas. They're negotiations over who sets the pace, who holds attention, and whose voice shapes direction. If this happens once, it's noise. If it happens repeatedly, it becomes a pattern others begin to expect. Not consciously, not maliciously, but socially. Over time, frequent interruption without pushback teaches one thing. Your time in the conversation is negotiable, and once that's established, people don't feel like they're cutting you off. They feel like they're using space that was never firmly yours to begin with. And once that expectation forms, it doesn't stay limited to conversation. Because conversational space is one of the first social territories people use to gauge rank. Who finishes their thoughts? Who adjusts? Who yields? These patterns quietly shape how others approach you outside of discussion. If your speaking space feels flexible, your decision space begins to feel flexible too. Your opinions feel more negotiable. Your preferences feel easier to override. Not because people consciously downgrade you, but because their brain has already categorized you as someone who adapts rather than enforces. And once that category is formed, future interactions require less caution and less calibration. The cost of adjusting you and has already been measured. And here's where people draw the wrong conclusion. They assume respect is about being liked in conversation. But respect is often about something quieter. Whether your presence changes how others regulate themselves. When it doesn't, the next test gets easier. The second type isn't about what is said. It's about how it's delivered. A slight smirk, a sarcastic edge, a tone that suggests your point is obvious, naive, or not worth serious consideration. On the surface, it's easy to brush off. Maybe they're just joking. Maybe you're reading too much into it. But tone is one of the fastest ways humans adjust social rank. Because tone doesn't argue with your idea, it shrinks your position. Picture sharing a suggestion, and someone responds with, "Yeah, sure," in a voice that carries more dismissal than agreement. They didn't debate you. They didn't disagree. But the emotional weight of your idea just got lowered. People subconsciously track whose words carry gravity and whose words can be lightly brushed aside. A dismissive tone is a compression move. It reduces the perceived seriousness of what you say without open conflict. And when that tone is used repeatedly without consequence, it teaches something important. It teaches that your seriousness is adjustable, that your contributions can be downgraded in emotional value without disrupting the interaction. Over time, the people stop treating your words as statements that carry weight. They become optional background input, Not because you changed, Mike, but because the social response to you did. Here's why this matters more than it seems. Social perception doesn't reset between interactions, it accumulates. Each dismissive moment becomes part of a growing pattern in how others internally categorize you. Not as someone to challenge, not as someone to confront, but as someone whose presence doesn't require emotional adjustment. And that distinction is critical because people naturally regulate themselves around those they respect. They watch their tone, they choose words more carefully, they calibrate how they respond. When that regulation disappears, it doesn't feel dramatic, it just feels casual. And casual treatment, repeated often enough, quietly lowers perceived rank. The third type of disrespect is quieter, but more revealing. You speak, you offer an idea, you make a suggestion, and it simply passes. No acknowledgement, no response. The conversation moves on as if your contribution never entered the room. It's rarely dramatic. There's no rejection, no disagreement, just absence. Imagine suggesting a plan during a group discussion. No one responds. 5 minutes later, someone else repeats a similar idea. And now it's discussed. It's subtle, hard to call out, easy to rationalize. But socially, being ignored is not neutral. It's a visibility test. Groups constantly adjust whose input is required for forward movement. Whose voice must be considered before decisions are made. When your input is consistently overlooked without follow-up, it sends a signal that your participation is optional. And the more often that pattern occurs, the more people subconsciously treat your presence as additive, not essential. You're still there, still included, but no longer central. And once someone is perceived as non-essential to decisions, their influence doesn't disappear suddenly. It fades gradually. What makes this especially powerful is how groups handle influence. In any social setting, people are constantly, silently tracking who shapes outcomes, whose input shifts direction, whose voice changes decisions, whose presence alters the flow of interaction. When your contributions don't change the trajectory, others begin to unconsciously treat you as socially non-disruptive. That might sound neutral, but in social systems, neutrality often means low influence. You're still liked, still included, but not factored in when weight is assigned. And once that position stabilizes, people stop checking how you might respond because they don't expect resistance to matter. This is how normalization begins. Not through confrontation, not through a clear demotion, but through small adjustments in how seriously your presence is treated. And once that shift stabilizes, the next behaviors feel less surprising. The fourth type of disrespect doesn't even happen during interaction. It happens before it begins. Someone is consistently late to meetings, calls, and plans. There's always a reason. Traffic, busy day, something came up. Individually, each incident feels understandable. Life happens. But repeated lateness is not just a scheduling issue, it's a priority calibration. Time is one of the clearest signals of perceived importance. People naturally allocate punctuality where social cost is highest. Picture waiting at a cafe, 5 minutes late becomes 10. You check your phone. No update yet. When they arrive, it's casual and no urgency. The conversation continues as normal. Nothing explodes, no argument happens. But a social calculation just updated. Does my delay create consequences? Or does the schedule flex around me? If nothing changes, a conclusion is formed. Not verbally, not consciously, but socially. Your time is lower cost. And once that hierarchy is established, it doesn't stay limited to punctuality. It often spreads into how much effort, attention, and consideration your interactions receive. The fifth type of disrespect is the most visible, but often disguised as helpfulness. You say something in front of others, and someone corrects you publicly. Sometimes it's small, a detail, a wording change. Sometimes it's framed politely. But public correction is not just about accuracy. It's about positioning. Because status in groups isn't just about who is right, it's about who is allowed to reposition whom. Imagine sharing information in a group, and someone jumps in with, "Actually, that's not quite right." The correction might be valid, but the timing and setting shift the moment from informational to social. It subtly lowers your authority, while raising theirs. Not dramatically, just enough to shift perception. And if that happens repeatedly without resistance or recalibration, a new social image forms. You are someone whose statements are open to public adjustment. Over time, people don't just listen to what you say, they look to see who validates it, and that changes your standing in the room, without a single direct challenge ever occurring. There's an important detail here that often goes unnoticed. None of these behaviors require hostility to work. They function precisely because they remain socially deniable. Each moment stays small enough that calling it out would feel like overreacting. So instead of confronting the behavior, people adjust internally. They lower expectations. They reduce emotional investment. They apply less social caution, and those internal adjustments accumulate, not into resentment, not into conflict, but into a subtle downgrade in how seriously your presence is treated. No one announces that shift. It just becomes the new baseline. And once a baseline forms, most people stop questioning it. None of these moments look like major disrespect. They're small, plausible, easy to excuse. That's what makes them effective. Because status rarely drops through one dramatic event. It shifts through repeated signals about what your boundaries can absorb. These behaviors aren't just rudeness. They're information gathering. Each one asks the same quiet question. How much can I adjust this person's space without resistance? And every time the answer comes back the same. People don't just notice, they adapt. They begin to predict you. And prediction changes behavior. When someone feels they already know how you'll respond, your tolerance, your flexibility, your willingness to absorb, they stop hesitating. They stop softening their tone. They stop second-guessing how far they can go. Not out of disrespect, but out of reduced uncertainty. And in social dynamics, reduced uncertainty often means reduced caution. Their tone changes slightly, their timing shifts, their level of consideration adjusts, not all at once, but enough that the overall pattern begins to feel normal. And once those small tests start feeling normal, the pattern becomes harder to spot. That's where gradual normalization begins.